Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're from. Welcome to this webinar on making the most of your endpoint detection and response technology. As always on our webinars, if for any reason you lose connection or have to exit the webinar early, don't worry, as we will be sending you this recorded version as well. I also just want to point out, please do take a look at some of the attachments for this webinar, which you can see on the pane in BrightTalk itself. There are various content there that you can download and take a look at as well. That is all related to this webinar. So let's get started then, shall we? I'm Ben Chant, Product Marketing Manager at Cyberproof, and today I'm joined by Niels Hanna and Eric Day. Niels, do you want to start the introductions?
Yes, thanks, Ben. Hi, my name is Niels. I am a solution architect at Cyberproof. I cover mainly the continental or Central European area, and I have about 25 years experience in IT, or almost 20 exclusively focusing on security. And I have covered operations. I've done many years of operations in multinational companies. I have been a consultant. I've been an advisor. I'm now a solution architect, and have historically had a lot of experience in the endpoint area. So endpoint security, endpoint analytics, and very glad to work with EDR technology. I think it's a very good technology. Lots of potential, but also, of course, if there's potential, lots of pitfalls for customers that we want to address today. So looking forward to that.
Thanks. To you, Eric.
Hi, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Niels. Hello, everyone. I'm Eric. I'm leading the MEDR service in Cyberproof. On my previous work, I used to work as an malware analyst in one of the EDR vendors research team, used to implement new behavioral analysis into the product. And in addition to that, I was supporting customer with implementing and using the EDR platform on the most efficient way. In addition to that, I have various experience with deploy and maintain several EDR systems, CrowdStrike, Cybereason, and more. So you can say that I have the knowledge and the experience in both of the vendor side and the customer side. So I'm familiar with the struggles and the challenges from both sides, and we're going to discuss some of these challenges today.
Great, thank you both. So as you both referred to, we're here to talk about whether you've invested in EDR technology or whether you're looking to invest in EDR technology. How can you make the most of it? As we all know, endpoints continue to be used as entry points into the organization's crown jewels, and traditionally AV tools were built to detect those signature-based malware attacks. But today it's different. Today attackers can use fileless malware, they can use zero-day exploits and other types of advanced persistent threats in an attack campaign. And these threats don't use signatures. So traditional AV programs aren't necessarily able to detect and stop them. And even what the so-called, next generation AV tools as well, or just relying on web gateways, etc. So EDR was born. EDR platforms were built to provide that comprehensive visibility into endpoints and servers, monitor behaviors, spot abnormal behaviors, and they provide that in-depth and wide coverage of data and really rich level of information, critical forensic information, including process actions, file access, network events, registry data, etc. But moving from traditional endpoint security solutions to EDR technology is a big jump, and it can leave some large gaps in knowledge, resources, and processes, skills that are needed to make the most of it. So, for us, we continue to see areas where organizations struggle to maximize this investment and take advantage of these kind of rich capabilities. So we want to go through some of this today. Let me just show you specifically some of the areas we're going to cover on this slide. In terms of those challenges with EDR, we're going to touch on 3 key ones. Firstly, managing the volume of those alerts within the EDR platform itself. Distinguishing between false positive and genuine alerts. That's a particularly well-known issue, I think, in the industry, and something which EDR definitely provides the ability to be able to distinguish between these, but we want to go into a bit more depth as to why it can still be an issue and how to circumvent that. Thirdly, how you can continuously improve detection and response through use cases, updating policies, configurations, etc. And then we'll actually cover how to overcome these challenges, such as optimizing endpoint security policies, how to do that correctly, using EDR for threat hunting in the right way, what kind of other techniques you can do on top of that, and then managing use cases in an agile way as well. So with that, I'll start with probably you, Niels. I wanted to maybe go into a bit about the alert fatigue issue, because this isn't just with the SIM, it's with EDR. It could be with EDR as well if you're not putting in the right processes. So are you able to just take us through specifically what that challenge is?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, maybe to start out with, it's probably the number one issue that I see with customers when I speak to them when they're transferring from I want to say, classic MV solution to an EDR solution. EDR has the biggest benefit that it provides a wealth of information, and that's also the biggest pitfall for most customers. Instead of simply saying, kind of binary thinking, do I have malware, do I not have malware? Or maybe, some organizations actually say, we're not sure based on a couple of other indicators, so they might implement a certain grayscale. EDR technology now all of a sudden provides you information on process activity. You all of a sudden have information about child processes. You see modification to the registry, what has been done by what process. You see network connections, where they're going, how much data volume is going, egress, so outgoing or incoming. We all of a sudden see files being analyzed or accessed, but we also need to be able to actually understand what happens in the command line. And all of that is being displayed and analyzed by EDR. And it's so easy to get lost in this wealth of information because I think it's just way too much. So people cannot actually analyze it due to the sheer volume. Or what happens very often is it's actually a combination between not having enough in-depth knowledge. And I know that we're also going to cover that later on. But all of a sudden, customers or organizations need to understand what happens on the OS, how the OS actually works, how applications work, something that they never had to do before. And it just all creates so much noise that I feel very much reminded on what we had in general IT, a couple of, or let's say a decade ago, where we just called it alert fatigue because there were so many things to handle that we did not manage to actually find the needle in the haystack. So I know this is just from me as when I was a consultant speaking to customers, now being a solution architect, having regular interaction with customers that all face this issue. But I think Eric is really good, due to his role in our operations team and being an EDR lead, that can tell about this or confirm this firsthand, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So this evaluation between from EPP to EDR that you've mentioned is creating two major gaps. The first gap is the skill. Suddenly, from a system that are, as you said, brings you kind of black and white alerts, whether I have a signature-based malware detected or not, suddenly the analyst is getting an alert that contains a large amount of data. Some of it you can see in the slide, and you suddenly need this proper skill to investigate this type of alert. So this is the first gap. And the second gap is you will get much more alerts, and some of them will be false positive. So this handling with a huge amount of false positive sometimes is really affecting badly on our customers, and this is the two gaps that are making handling EDR much more difficult.
Yeah, and I would say that this kind of brings us on to the next challenge, really around the theme of the old maxim of it's not if, it's when, and it's certainly not something to take lightly, even when you're investing in EDR. It's a technology that needs to be used in the right way, and but you need to remember that obviously threats will still find a way through. At some point they will come through. Nothing is 100% secure. So I wanted to actually cover this because perhaps, Eric, you can start on this particular challenge, because it's quite a simple concept, but yet it's still something we continuously hear from the market in terms of, well, what can I do beyond what the EDR is doing to make sure that I'm also paying attention to those alerts that slip through that perhaps are true positives. So I'm just wondering if you can perhaps touch on this.
Yeah, well, so there are several amazing EDR platforms out there. These platforms are arriving with a default set of behavioral analysis rules and detections. But as we know from not just EDR, for any other security system, not everything will be detected. And why is that? Because attackers are constantly reinventing themselves with new tactics, new technique, releasing new variants to their malware each and every time. And we always need to stick and decrease this gap. So this is demands from the security teams to constantly create, test and deliver new detection rules, customized IOA rules, IOCs, and not always there's the proper time to scope this data and hunt beyond what is detected. As you said, EDR is creating an overwhelming amount of data. So this is one of the struggles and challenges. In addition to that, if you want to test these rules, you want to test whether the EDR is detecting a new variant or new attack. Not in most of the organization, you ain't going to find a red lab. Okay, and when I'm saying a red lab, I'm referring to a lab that you can execute malicious executables and malwares and samples and test these things. And all of this, let's say, even if you have the time to do it, you still will need to get proper leads from threat intelligence teams, from threat hunting teams, from analysts, and it's not always existing in organizations.
Yeah, and I think, Eric, what you are outlining there, if I may summarize that a little bit different, is actually, it sounds like EDR gives you a lot of opportunities, but we also have to consider the fact that customers are unique. Yes, most of them use predominantly Windows in their environment, and probably Linux or Unix systems on the server side here and there, or some use a bit more. But even if we're saying the technology stack is actually the same, the way that it's set up and the way that's being operated and the way what other technologies they have around it, that is actually what I see, due to my expertise, is always unique. And therefore, the configuration that you mentioned and the testing, that is also unique. So that means that this ability to be very granular also brings the almost obligation to customers to fine-tune that. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done by the customer to not just fine-tune that, but then also to, what you said, to use red teaming to validate that configuration change that you have made, or the fine tuning that you have made, that is actually working properly. And if you cannot ensure that, then rest assured there will be actually more things that you will not be detecting. And to just throw, other concerns, and that probably most of our customers or the listeners are totally familiar with, is just think about how also the technology stack that we are all using or leveraging has changed the way that we have to work. All I'm going to say is Windows 10 brought in all of a sudden this waterfall approach of every month there being a couple of dozen fixes and patches that are being deployed to the endpoint. And then not at the same time, but also on I think it's actually bi-monthly schedule, we have updates to Office 365, which again, bring in fixed vulnerabilities, but also always bring in new vulnerabilities. The attack surface is therefore constantly changing. That also means that we actually need to constantly change our configuration and validate these configuration changes, making sure that we detect everything. So I think that is a huge change that we have seen in the market, or not just in the market, but in the entire IT sector in the last couple of years, which is a very big challenge for our customers. And EDR just underlines that. And I think what, Eric, you should probably elaborate a little bit in the next slide on how that actually also makes a difference or impact on detecting false positives compared to true positives. That, we cannot just rely on this threat intel from vendors anymore, saying this is good or this is bad.
Yeah, and I think this is. Oh, sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ben. It's okay.
No, I was just going to say to Neil's point. It is, one of the fundamental reasons is that kind of the needle in the haystack, right? And the being able to find what is distinguished as a true positive versus a false positive. And you can see in this example, Eric, you can go into this in a bit more depth, but you can see, classic examples of where even a internal admin user is using admin credentials stored on their local PC, and then using a RDP connection to access a critical server. It's that connection which then can be leveraged for lateral movement, right? And how do you tell whether that's false positive versus true positive? And will the EDR be able to do that for you, or provide you with enough context, not just necessarily all of the information, because it sure will provide you with the information, but can you then bring that together into the context of an actual incident? So yeah, Eric, can you take us through a couple of these examples?
Yeah, of course. So as you said, one of the biggest challenges is distinguishing legitimate from malicious activity, and I chose these two examples. Both of the things are detected by the EDR and created an alert. So as you can see, there are a lot of similarities between the true positive, which is and one of Cofter malware variants, and this is part of the chain of attack. And the second one, which was detected, but it was an IT legitimate operation, an authorized operation in the organization. So I'm assuming that a lot of analysts that will see these two chain of events without without the patches that I put over here and the explanation, they might think that both of them are false positive, and others might think that both are true positives because of the similarity. You see that all of them are legitimate OS processes, all of them are signed and verified by Microsoft. If from some reason the analyst has decided to check the hash in VirusTotal, it will be detected as clean. And the EDR was pointing on the same suspicious indicator, in this case, WMI remote executions. And in both of the cases, there are execution of scripts at the end. Once it's a batch script from the CMD, and the second one is an HTA file. So all of this similarity can be very confusing for an analyst to detect between a true positive and false positive. What he needs to do to do this distinguish is, first of all, he has to have a familiarity with the organization authorized activity, just like in this false positive case that we're presenting over here. Whether it's the right way to work as an IT, I'm not sure, probably not, but it's still an authorized activity. The analyst should have a deep knowledge in fileless and living of the land attacks, and deep knowledge in OS internals and OS structure. And these things cannot be. It's not just you're doing some course or something like this, and then you have this knowledge. This is something that you need to gain with experience of constantly investigating EDR alerts and learn a lot about the OS system and about the attackers. And you need to take all of this knowledge that you've gathered and use it to detect suspicions inside indicators that the EDR is providing, whether it's command line, and abnormal parent-child relations, and script execution, etc. So, sorry. This is the major issue that analysts have with investigating EDR alerts and distinguishing legitimate from malicious activity.
Thanks, Eric. We did actually get a couple of questions just come through. So there's one which perhaps is more relevant for this slide and the slide before. So I'll ask this question to you, Eric. One listener asked, where does EDR technology stop and human-based research starts? Or in other words, where do you see the limitations of the current technology-based approach, such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, provided by EDR solutions versus the requirement to enhance human-based identification and research? Does that make sense?
I don't want to say that the technology stops in some point, because at the end, if the technology was creating the alert, so it did help you to get to the point. But I would say that in cases of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and signature based, it's the technology that's doing most of the work. But when it goes to when you're getting a behavioral analysis detection, or a detection of something that might look like a fileless attack or living of the land attack, this is where the skills of the analyst is the bigger value that's needed in order to triage the alert properly.
Sorry, if I may add to that, I think, Eric, you're setting a very good point, right? It still in the end boils down to an analyst actually doing that, because if we're talking about machine learning, then we need to tell the computer what is a false positive. We need to tell them what is a true positive, so they can actually take that experience on and continue to make assumptions going forward. But it's never going to be with any of those technologies that you, out of the box, turn it on, put it in a learning mode, and let it just run for a couple of days or months or maybe a year, and then all of a sudden it will be fine-tuned and it can distinguish all of that. You need to give the technology, even with machine learning and AI, you need to give it very clear guidance, and that guidance boils down to to the analyst having exactly that kind of knowledge, in-depth knowledge about the OS, and also being able to interpret this data then. When it deviates from normal, I want to say, OS behavior or application behavior, but it still might be very legitimate because it's a customized application. So I think Eric is totally right that this technology can help you to do the legwork, but in the end, it's actually the analyst that somehow has to make that call and the decision and distinguish that.
Yeah, and I think this probably leads quite well into the next slide, which we wanted to bring up as well, because it's another important point around the need to be able to configure based on your unique environment, right? So, Niels, perhaps you can just cover this a little bit.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it also goes hand in hand to what Eric showed and explained on the slide before. So when I talk to customers over the last years, and really, I mean, 5 years, 7 years, maybe to even 10 years, it always boils down to the same issue. And for me, it's a vicious cycle that eventually needs to be broken through. And let's just say that we are implementing a new technology or an EDR technology from scratch because the customer doesn't have anything yet. We need to make sure that we do have enough time for the configuration, for the fine-tuning. Because the better job that we do there, the better testing we can do. Because if we don't do a good job at configuring, it usually is a very clear-cut sign that we're also going to try to cut corners during testing. So having limited testing, which in turn means if I didn't vet my configuration properly, I'm going to get a lot of alerts, true positives, false positives. And again, for me, from my experience, I can just say organizations that don't have enough time to do a configuration or configuration vetting properly, also not going to have enough resources to actually analyze the outputs properly. Which in turn actually brings us to the next step, that they're not seeing the relevant events. Those relevants are the true positives that just get missed because they are overlooked. They don't have the right in-depth knowledge, as Eric explained in the slide before. Which might mean that you actually do have a hopefully not too severe security incident, but most likely it's going to be severe. And another risk that you have is that you actually, due to this lack of knowledge, might not see the relevant event because you don't realize it's a false positive. And I've seen this with a couple of customers, luckily just a handful, where people have started escalating things, said that we do have a security incident here. And it turns out not to be a relevant incident. That was then later, we figured that out. But in the end, it cost those people reputation within the company. So they lost credibility to their superiors. And also very horrible is you're starting to go crazy, or organizations start to put out fires, getting really stressed and losing trust into that technology and also the ability of the people that work with them. And then you're actually just figuring out that you're at the beginning of that process again, because the less time you now have, because you're firefighting and putting out fires, is time that you're missing from this configuration or continuous configuration adjustment and testing that you need to do. In the end, I can tell I have seen more than a fair share of implementations where customers lost either confidence in that, were saying they could not handle the output of it, and in the end, it was a misinvestment from a business point of view because they didn't get any real benefit from that. So it was just sitting around in the corner, and after a couple of years, when the maintenance contract was up for renewal or something, people are starting questions: do you really need this? And then you go back and reverting to and probably older, and I want to say probably also more inadequate solution. So that's really from my point as a solution architect, that really hurts me and is painful to see.
Thanks, Niels. Yeah, and I think you mentioned a couple of things here in terms of the timing, the resource, but also the technology. Some areas where you said, you still need to have that level of skill to know how to kind of to break that cycle, to make sure that you're getting that return on investment as well. So perhaps if I turn this spotlight to you, Eric, to summarize what Niels has gone through, do you see this as being fundamentally a skill issue, a process issue, or time issue, or something else, or a combination?
So I think it's a little bit of all of them, because after you deploy the EDR platform, you need to create a proper and efficient processes to handle this circle that Niels was mentioned. And this creating these processes demands skills, and skills demands a time for you to achieve and gain these skills. So I think it's a little bit of all of it. And as Niels mentioned, once organization is enter into this circle and cannot control it, it comes to a phase that you paid money for a platform, and yet you're using like 20 or 30% of his ability instead of using 90 or 100% of it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a couple of questions here I just want to touch on. One of them I will, I promise, get to a bit later, because I think perhaps it's more relevant for a section we're going to cover a bit later. But one of them is around the ability to distinguish between true positive and false positive. So perhaps, Eric, I'll ask you this question. Typical EDR vendors claim that they provide the analysis to distinguish between true positive and false positive as part of their service, part of their offering. Do you have a comment on that? Do you have a view on that? Is that true in some aspects, or does it need to be a combination? Yeah, go ahead.
You can say that every managed EDR service is provide this service to you. This is what needs to be done. Distinguish between this is something that needs to happen in the L1 phase. The distinguishing between true and false positives. So yes, both vendors and any provider of managed EDR should provide this type of service. Yeah.
And how about the EDR vendors themselves? I mean, I don't want to do a disservice to the vendors. We've got very close relationships with many of them, and use them for a lot of implementations with customers. But based on your knowledge of those kind of platforms, do they provide a means to be able to do that, or do they? Is there more that's needed?
So they will provide it, but in a lot of cases they will need authorized from the organizational customer himself, making sure that this is in fact false positives and or an authorized behavior by the organization, because as you saw earlier, it can be very similar. So there is no situation when you're getting 100% true positive from the vendor. It's not going to happen. The vendor will or any other managed EDR service will notify you on something that looks like false positive, but they will need your authorization and acceptance that this is in fact false positive based on the familiarity of the authorized behaviors in the organization.
Right. So it really is that combination between the vendor having that relationship with perhaps a provider who's got experience working with that vendor, understands how to implement that technology and manage it correctly, but also get the best out of the technology, as well as making sure the consumer has the right level of authorizations as well. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to move over to actually some of the more positive side of this webinar, really, how we can overcome some of these challenges. We've mentioned some recommendations previously, and we've touched on it, but there's a couple of key ones that I want to focus on. The first one being how you can actually customize endpoint security policies and profiles. So, Eric, perhaps you can start with this one. How can listeners, if there's something they can take away about from this webinar around updating those kind of policies that come with the platform, perhaps, or profiles, perhaps it's data encryption or anti-malware, whatever it may be, how can you make sure that you're continuously updating that in the right way?
Okay. So as we all know, EDR systems comes with the possibility to customize and adjust security policies, adjust features, activate on and off, put it on detection mode or prevention mode. So the best and recommended way to do it is doing it by phases when it comes to policies and profiles. When at start you don't want to activate aggressive prevention mode, because as we said earlier, EDR is also creating false positive, and you don't want it to affect your day-to-day work in the organization. So it should be a process of moving from transition from phase to phase, when the first phase will be aggressive monitoring in order to to expose all of the false positives out there and whitelist and fine tune them, and then slightly do an evaluation, look at on the statistics and true positive and false positive ratio, and based on that decide whether to go to a little more prevent mode. And just doing it in patient, it takes a little bit of time, but this is the best way to evaluate and improve your platform. Obviously, the vendors it happens when vendor is adding new features, new detection methods to the tool. And if you have the ability to test these tools on a lab environment or in a playground, something like that, this is the best thing to do, because at the end, for those who have experience with the deployment of EDR sensors, sometimes there are bugs and collisions with other products. It can be other security products, or it can be a printer solution or anything else. So if you have the ability to test it before implementing in production, it will be the best thing to do. And when it comes to an initial fine-tuning and ongoing fine-tuning, or with behavioral whitelisting rules, behavioral IOA whitelisting rules, you will need to find this balance between reducing false positives and yet retain platforms' high visibility and detection capabilities. For example, if in the organization there are authorized PowerShell behavior that constantly detected by the EDR, so you cannot whitelist PowerShell overall, because it's PowerShell. We know that adversaries and attackers are constantly using this tool. So you need to find this balance of making an efficient whitelisting and without hurting and damaging the detection visibilities or capabilities of the tool.
So if I may quickly just add on to that. So for me, from not a daily operations point of view, but from an architecture or consulting approach, that actually all sounds like we know what to do, or customers know what to do. And the steps are, I want to say, relatively easy, but the biggest challenge is that it takes time to fine-tune all of that, to go through each new release set, making sure what new features are coming in, what do the release notes say, do I turn that on, do I better turn that off, do I test it a bit longer? All of that takes time, and that is, you probably realize that I'm coming back to the same point over and over again. It's purely a matter of time being the main constraint, what's holding customers back, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But therefore, there's also the benefit. It's as easy, fixing all of these issues is as easy as fixing the time issue. If you have enough time, it's relatively easy and straightforward to do.
And actually, there's one question here that I wanted to that's being asked. I want to pass over to you, Niels. And I think it's maybe a good time to ask it, because actually, you need to consider this particular challenge which is occurring right now, the need to be able to evaluate and adjust updates. So one person was asking, actually I was asking you, Eric, sorry. I was asking, Eric, are we using different kind of platforms for EDR? I'm not sure whether this question is asking specifically whether you recommend that customers use multiple EDR iterations. So if this listener is able to maybe ask that question again in a slightly different way, maybe we can get a better answer. But perhaps that's one question I'll ask you, Eric, is whether it's recommended to use multiple EDR technologies, or if you're migrating from one to another, whether that's possible to do to manage multiple EDR systems.
So the answer is simple: no. You don't want to use more than one EDR platform, mainly because the sensor might collision and create massive errors and issues in the endpoint. So no, it's better to choose one and go one platform and go with it. And even you know what, it's not just EDR. Even when you're referring to the signature based mode on EDR and the NGAV module, it's not recommended to activate it in parallel to an other antivirus, not just EDR.
But I think it's also important, because I can also interpret this question, slightly different. I think all of the aspects that we are pointing out today, what the challenges are, what the solutions are, those are all applied to different EDR technologies. So this is not just or vendors. This is not just a issue statement and here's how you fix that guidance to one or two vendors, but this applies to all of them, because they all fundamentally have the same issues. Some more in one corner, others, have the weak point in another area.
Exactly, and I think this leads us on to a really critical point, which is the need to be able to test this, test new updates correctly, test configurations correctly. So Eric, is there obviously at Cyberproof we've got our red team labs that we use to conduct this testing of different configuration changes in a proper lab environment. So we're able to do that. For a customer who's looking to do the same, or maybe leverage a provider to help do the same thing with different policies and profiles, how do you suggest they approach that? Do you think there's anything particular they need to be aware of, or asking the provider specific techniques that they use? What would you say to that?
So I on the latest slide I've mentioned if you have a lab environment to do this testing, then it's a huge advantage, and it's not just for testing new features and new policies configuration. It's also for knowing and be certain of what your tool is capable of, and because sometimes the difference of between anti-malwares being not anti-malware, sorry, and ransomware being blocked and ransomware being undetected and unblocked is one parameter that you need to change from on to off in the policy, and maybe activate or deactivate one of the features. And so, as we know, the EDR detection is being built based on existing techniques that was discovered in the wild by the vendor's research team. But if a new variant is being discovered, so you can take it, you can test it in the lab and see if the tool is still useful against it. And if not, you can check whether something in the policies need to be changed, whether I can add some detection rules to detect it. So, and this is the huge advantage for those who have this type of environment.
We've got a question that's just come in actually, which may be relevant for either of you, perhaps more with Niels if you're involved in with recent customer engagements. But this question is asking whether an EDR that stores telemetry data, whether the EDR that's storing telemetry data can correlate with other security controls like Active Directory activity to provide user behavior analysis to replace your security analytics platform. What's your experience with existing customers? Perhaps one thing I would say is to take a look at the blog that I think we've attached to this webinar. That might explain some aspects of it, perhaps not everything. But Niels or Eric, either of you, is anything you want to say around that?
I think it's certainly something that we do see, that there's a trend in the market positioning, I want to say, exactly this kind of message that the EDR platform can already correlate with different information sources, which actually does make sense, to just provide more context to the event. To see user or user information and parameters being pulled in from the Active Directory. Makes total sense. Currently, I do see that as more of a enrichment that historically organizations probably have done in another platform. But that also means for me that these behavior analytics or analysis aspect is not going to be replaced by an EDR solution, solely due to the fact that we would now only focus our entire view on the endpoint, and we are totally ignoring any other aspect of our environment, whether that is backend, where often customers don't have EDR agents running on the backend on servers. What about cloud environments? What about application data, where you can actually see what kind of behavior has or what users have done in an application? All of that you would very much ignore if you would decommission your, I want to say, traditional security analytics platform. So my view there is very clearly that it's not going to be replaced. And I also don't have any customers, I have not talked to anybody that actually goes that route, because it's very apparent to them.
Yeah, thanks, Niels. I'm conscious of time as well. There's another question, but I'll try and get to it a little bit later. Wanted to cover the aspects of threat hunting as well. Even though the EDR can provide an overwhelming amount of data and that can be seen as a challenge, obviously this is an opportunity as well, and we may be able to find some indicators that haven't been identified within this information. So typically we look at it from three aspects. One of them being the ability to constantly search for malicious IOCs on the endpoint. So using dashboards and queries, mass IOCs, retro hunts, tailored IOC lookups, etc. But there's also two other aspects that we see as being key to using as part of that coverage as a source for threat hunting. So one is the behavioral hunting on the endpoint. So using suspicious executions from temp folders, looking for uncommon processes, and we've covered a little bit of that earlier on. But this is a practice which a threat hunter should be able to conduct themselves as part of their skill set. And then finally, you need to be able to have that information, IOAs, not just IOCs, but behavioral IOAs as well, that are coming from incident leads, incident reports, and intelligence leads. For example, from your sector, perhaps on specific malware campaigns. And there's a bit more depth that we can go into here. We are running a little bit out of time, so perhaps I'll skip this bit. But here's a good example. For example, where we've taken one of our reports that we give to customers, and we use it, and when you read a bit more around it, you can learn a bit more about the IOA rules that are included. And we provide this to our customers on a weekly basis, and our threat hunting team actually use this to conduct those hunts as well. So they're not just relying on the EDR to look for known IOCs. I'll just want to move on to this next section, optimizing EDR use cases. Perhaps Niels, do you want to start by just going over the ideal process for use case development within the EDR? Yeah, absolutely.
But I think before I go into that, maybe we should actually say what we understand as a use case. When I talk about the use case, I'm actually saying in the beginning, we said we need to fine-tune our detection rules, which is the basic step. That's what we want to achieve, but that's only, I want to say, a part of the equation. A lot of customers are thinking, oh, I need to detect this and I need to detect that. Can I detect this? Can I detect that? But the idea should actually be, you detected, great. Now you have a security issue. What do you do now? So that's also part of that. But so speak to really think about this detection rule then, that's the first part of the use case. We, of course, need to think about what do we actually want to protect. We're going to very quickly find out that endpoints or assets are not the same. A C-level laptop has probably a much higher value or needs a much higher protection than I want to say, sorry, I'm just drawing a blank, so I'll just take, a software developer that always sits in-house, that doesn't travel a lot, just due to also the potentially confidential information that's sitting on there. I need to think about what kind of gaps I need to fill, because I might actually channel information already through centralized or decentralized network security controls that already protect me and detect certain things. So it's really then the idea about having a rule, having a process how to follow up on that. And then one of the questions was obviously already integrating information such as Active Directory in that. So we also have to think about how can we actually make sense out of that information. Eric already explained to that a lot of that is based on experience of the analyst, but technical information that we have seen this as flagged suspicious by VirusTotal, for example, gives us context. Seeing information from abuse IP databases also gives us more context how to interpret an incident. And of course, ideally, we actually want to be able to automate a response and not just want to isolate or shut down a machine, which is kind of like the default action that we do see with a lot of the EDR technologies. There's either good or bad. There's nothing really in between. So often it is we can kill the machine, separate from the network, or not do anything at all. And of course, we need to also get visibility over that over the long period. So reporting is another big aspect of that. And that's all kind of like what we understand, what for us belongs to a use case. And maybe it's good to have a look at a few more concrete examples. So I already said that we are talking about different technologies, and that some of them are really good in one aspect, others are not so good in other aspects. So some of them are really good on Linux, others are not so good on Linux. So if you might have chosen a solution that is not so good on Linux, but decide to deploy it on a Linux environment, you might actually have to create a lot of those detection rules yourself. So the question is, what do you actually want to detect is then pointed out in the detection rule, or sorry, in the middle column here, in the detection column. And of course, always the question is then, what is appropriate to your environment? Because for some organizations, killing a process is a totally fine decision. For others, they're saying like, oh God, no, I don't want to have that. I just want to made aware of that so I then can download the file, for example, to analyze it. And I want to isolate the endpoint. While for another organization, that is a totally unacceptable behavior. What we often see is that acceptable response varies dramatically from what kind of asset are we talking about. Again, imagine taking the CEO's laptop offline because there's something suspicious going on, might not fly too good in certain environments.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add on it that the EDR, most of EDRs is creating alerts that rely on various tactics and techniques, and obviously not all of them should be treated the same way. There are a huge difference between ransomware and credential theft activity or a persistency activity. So this is where the big advantage of use cases is. And in terms of IOA based detection rules, customized detection rules that based on the reports that showed by Ben earlier, is giving you the advantages of the analyst from the first second of the investigation is aware of what is this pattern is related to. If we will take an example, the latest Microsoft Exchange vulnerability and exploitation. So there are already forensics indicators that can be used to create, that can be leveraged to a detection rules. And in this case, the analyst is aware immediately that this pattern may related to this specific vulnerability and campaign. So this is one of the main benefits of using use cases.
Yeah, thanks, Eric and Niels. And here's I think this is a good example of the process that we can say is a good best practice to use. It's not necessarily as easy as it may look on a slide. I mean, this is an example of a process that we actually use, and we call it our use case factory. So internally we've got our own catalog of over 500 plus use cases, which we continuously define, test, and tune and deploy into the customer's environment. And as you can see on the left, you need to consider obviously what's inputting into that use case definition and that request. So how are you aligning it to the meter attack framework? Are you conducting scenario workshops to be able to look at where those gaps are? In EDR, do you have a red lab testing environment to be able to then input that new information or any gaps into the use case definition as well? And remember that this is always including not just the detection rule itself, but obviously the response steps as well. Any level of automation that's needed and that's required, reporting, etc. And then obviously input from the security monitoring and threat intel as well. I don't know if Niels or Eric, you wanted to cover anything else off on this particular side in terms of the best approach.
I certainly think it's valid to point out that even though this is what you said, what we call our use case factory, I think this methodology it's open for everybody to use. So thinking about this as a structured approach to analyze your input, thinking about what kind of parameters you need to have to develop those different aspects of the use cases, as 2 slides earlier, is then actually going to give you a very structured way to get to where you need to go to, and then take that output and feed the circle from the beginning again. So I think this is also something where people might want to think about if they want to keep this kind of activity in-house, just as a structure. Because it's not tied down to any kind of organization or to any kind of EDR technology or platform that you're using. You can use this methodology, the structured way, for any kind of technology that you're actually using.
Yeah, and it's exactly you see the title at the top there, the agility and risk driven. It's exactly that term that's really important when we're talking about a use case management, because the whole idea of this is to be able to keep up the pace with the changing threat landscape, right? So as soon as there are new attacker techniques that are being crafted by adversaries, 0-day attacks, exploits, whatever it may be, there needs to be a process in place where new use case groups or new use case kits, however you may call them, are being created, continuously tuned in that agile cycle. So actually, this process that we use at Cyberproof, we use an agile software development principle or methodology, which is this continuous development. So this is what we do with our clients, and you can see the little icon there of characters building those blocks. we included that there because the other point we want to make is the need to have that skill set there, those teams there, especially from the likes of security engineers, incident responders who know the kind of steps typically that are relevant for types of attacks. But also something that answers a pretty previous question around enrichment and integrations. As you can see, there's the third step, which is the integrations and automation. So what log sources do you want to integrate? What information do you want to integrate into the EDR from, for example, the Active Directory? That's where that can be developed and customized, and where perhaps the EDR doesn't provide that, who's able to then help you to create that new use case as quickly as possible. So there is one more question I just want to ask you both. Again, this is something which hopefully one of the blogs which is attached to the webinar can answer. But perhaps this is something that I know, Niels, you've talked about a lot with customers. What is the advantage of joining a SIM with EDR as a replacement or augmentation? Have your customers seen any benefits or issues with this?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in and say, have we seen customers that to replace them? No. From a professional point of view, I have to say, luckily not, because it's my professional opinion that you would clearly limit the scope of what you're able to see. You will not extend it. Therefore, that for me also implies the answer already. Is there a benefit of augmenting both of them? Absolutely. However, I would advise against ingesting all raw data from an EDR into a SIM without thinking about it, because it's going to generate a lot of double cost, essentially, because you're just shifting the analysis from the EDR platform into the SIM. So then you also need to think about how you're going to create all of your detection rules in there. However, it doesn't make a lot of sense to already take an alert or a suspicious behavior and to pass this over into your SIM, because if it's not really malicious, it might be still an event that is very valuable in the greater context to in the SIM. So if you say this was a suspicious behavior on the endpoint, and a couple of minutes later you see a suspicious activity from the same user from that endpoint, but now the suspicious activity is coming from a backend application, then it just creates a lot more benefit for analysis to see the bigger picture. So that's where we definitely do see this augmentation aspect kicking in and creating a lot of benefits.
Yeah, well, I'm totally agree with your message, Niels. And if we discussed use cases before, that even though you're not injecting the raw data of the EDR, still the detection data and the alerting data is still very valuable, and you can use it inside use cases, and you can use it to correlate between several systems, and all of that you can do using the SIM. So I will also highly recommend to inject EDR alerts into the SIM. Yeah.
I think one point I want to also raise on that is perhaps consider having one centralized platform as well that can act as that single view, or perhaps a largely overused term, a single pane of glass. For us, we use our CDC platform, and that's something that we implement with each customer, and that acts as a collaborative single environment where you can have full transparency in the activities of both us as the provider and yourselves as the customer as well. So that integrates natively with all SIM technologies and EDRs, vulnerability management platforms, threat intel platforms, etc. So we find that acts as a really good solution, because for them, they don't need to worry about managing the technology. They don't need to worry about whether the SIM, how the SIM needs to integrate with EDR, how they're able to get the enrichment from multiple sources. That can be done by us. We can manage that technology, and then the only thing we provide the customer with is that Cyberproof Defense Center platform. We call it the CDC. It means they're able to have day-to-day visibility of those activities, and a single place for the security analysts to conduct some management and some handling as well. So I'd certainly advise as well, looking at perhaps SOAR platforms or anything like that. But for us and for our customers, we use a platform which uses SOAR-like capabilities, but it also has collaboration features which you can use to speak with our analysts real time as well. So that helps to kind of consolidate everything into a single view.
Yeah, and another thing that we need to remember, that in addition, even if you're working in a single pane of glass, you need to remember, even if you're investigating and getting the alert via SIEM or via the CDC or any other system as that, you need to remember not to turn the EDR to just a log source. You need to remember that this is an high level and advanced analysis tool that can be used for threat hunting and for additional action. So in addition to that, you need to remember not to turn it into a log source, just a log source.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we've gone a little over time, but I just want to thank everyone for attending. You would have heard multiple references regarding content and reports, things like that. Earlier, we referenced our weekly CTI reports that we give to customers. If you want to be part of that, if you want to receive those reports, please do reach out to Eric, Niels, and myself on LinkedIn, and we can look to set that up for you. That means you'll be able to get updates on specific threats, and we can see if we can sign you up for that, and perhaps for the newsletter as well, to make sure you're getting all of those rich pieces of content as well. Please do stay tuned for any future webinars as well. And thank you for your time. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Niels.
Thank you very much, Ben.
I'll give a final wave goodbye to everyone. Thanks for taking part.
Bye.
All
Bye.
right.
Thank you for joining. Bye.
Bye, everyone.